All right, I think we've waited long enough. See who else could get down the hill. My name's Joel McCarty. There's Brock Wilson, the tall and handsome one, and then the one that's left is Chris Reitman. It's Reitman, turns out, not Reitman. And this is the statutorily required budget hearing, which means that we're supposed to hear from you about the materials that we put in front of you. The way the system works in New Hampshire is we'll select them, and anyone who can help it prepare a draft budget and a draft set of warrant articles. The first phase is that we discuss them in public at this meeting. The second phase is the deliberative session in February where we modify them, accept them or reject them as the voters in the room choose. And the third phase is in March when we ballot on those items, and at that point it's simply a yes or no. So tonight you have the opportunity to say that number's too big or that number's too small. February you have the opportunity to make that number what you think it ought to be, regardless of what the selectmen think. And in March you have the opportunity to make that number real or unreal. Simple as that. So the format for these meetings has always been pretty informal, which I certainly approve of. We don't mess with motions or points of order. We try to take turns talking. We want as much as possible for you to run the progress of the meeting, and none of us want to stay out too late in the snow, but I'm going to stay here until you give up. We're going to start with Article 2, which is the budget. And that's the sheet with hundreds of lines of numbers on it. And let's be clear that this is a proposed budget, not the budget that you will see in March. So you get a chance tonight to advise the selectmen about how they should modify that. We'll take your advice in whole or in part or not at all. The results of those discussions that we have will be posted on the glass at the town office by the 24th, I believe. I could be wrong about the date, but well in advance of the February deliberative session. And at that point, it's all up to you. It's no longer in our hands. We get exactly the same number of votes that you all get. So, Chris, you wanted to summarize the difference between this working budget and what we did last year.
This is Joel's way of saying he never heard from me that I would like to summarize that, but he loves to put me on the spot. So thank you.
You should do that by now.
Yes, and I'm starting to get used to that. The budget's up a little bit over last year. I think we are looking at about a 2% increase over last year's budget, which is still within the 3% cap that the voters have placed on the select board. What we have funded in here, which I think is important, and I think speaks in large part to why it's a little higher than it was last year, was taking a recommendation from our Human Resources Committee that we put together and we got volunteers for. We came back with some recommendations on how we may better run the town. And one of their recommendations was to employ a town administrator. The role of a town administrator is to act more as a direct supervisor to the department. So Joel's got a job, I've got a job, Rock's got a job. This person's job would be to be in the offices when they're open and to act as that person who's reviewing purchases, trying to find better deals for the town, making sure that department heads are keeping their departments online and doing what they should be doing. And most importantly to me, being a good fiduciary manager of the town's scarce resources, which come from all of you. So in summary, I think that's why, that's one of the reasons, but I think that's a significant reason as to why we're a little bit up over where we were last year. Rock, you got anything to add?
Well, I did sit on that human resources committee, and it was definitely found that great idea to have the town administrator. And it would be an administrator that answers to the selectmen, not a person that's, not a person that is, elected or anything like that, so they do just answer to the selectmen. They'd be hired. That's the only reason the budget would be at the point it is, because it would be out otherwise.
Correct. Don?
When would you anticipate he would, or she, would start work?
I believe,
Thank you, John.
Good question.
I believe the budget in there includes 75% of a year's salary.
It's actually, the budget that Linda and I came up with after town meeting was 45%.
45% of,
Yep, so it would include the remaining year. It also includes 2 full-time health insurance, and then Linda's services act as a consulting basis as she closes out of the office.
So you're anticipating that they would start work about halfway through the year?
No, they would have to start much sooner than that, because there's things on a day-to-day basis and reports and DRAs that have to be done immediately.
So, from the office perspective, they should start as soon as we vote for them. And when do you anticipate, do you have someone in mind? When do you anticipate they would?
well, I think we may want to caucus a little bit on that between ourselves. My understanding was that we had budgeted 75% of their salary, assuming that it would take at least a quarter to find the right person and get them hired and like that.
So it's the budget numbers that are in doubt, but you're anticipating, you were intending for him to start at the end of the first quarter,
Or her,
or her.
at least that long.
Okay, what if the town next year thinks that they're doing a totally dreadful job and wants to get rid of them? Is that possible? I know that there's there's a statutory and
Yes.
2 different titles.
Yes, and that's why we call this a town administrator, not a town manager. Town manager is a role recognized by RSA, but it's an elected position, and that's not what we're doing. We are saying that this would be a hired position. And if the town no longer wishes to have that, let's assume they do now, but they don't next year, then the town meeting can absolutely defund it.
Gotcha.
Simple as that. Go ahead.
I have a question. I don't understand with the population of 1,940 people, why we would need an administrator when in the selectmen's meeting, it was cited that one town saved their salary on one item, and it was something that Alstead was already doing. So how are you gonna recoup the salary that you're paying this gentleman? Or lady?
Poor lady. I hate to, I'll be straightforward. I don't know the answer to your question. I don't know what that person may or may not identify. We anticipate that things will run smoother, that there'll be more eyes on each individual department budget. That things will be, somebody will have the time to make a few more phone calls to try to get a better deal on some project or on some equipment or on some material.
But isn't that up to the department heads?
It
I mean,
is.
that's why you have selectmen, and then you have all these separate departments, and you have
Understand.
department heads, that's their job, I just think it's another payroll.
And I am not a big bureaucracy guy, and I understand your point of view. But the fact, where at least I come from, and this is just my opinion, selectmen is not a full-time job. It is a role of executive government within a small town, and we don't have people that have 40 hours a week that are going to be able to supervise or watch everything that goes on. There are a surprisingly large number of things that occur in this town on a daily basis and throughout the course of a week. So my personal feeling is it's money well spent. I don't look at it as anything that I absolutely know is going to yield a particular result. But to me personally, I'm confident that having someone in that role would be a better thing than not having someone in that sort of a role.
Carol,
Yeah,
and then Mike.
I'm Carol Reller, acting chair of the AEBC, the Alstead Budget Committee, and I just wanted to support what Chris was saying about that. I'll give you a couple of examples that over the past year or so, we've developed something we call the punch list, which has been up on the town webpage, and that list seems to get longer and longer of things that we all need to look into. We formed this HR committee, we formed the AABC committee. There's what we call the EMSG, the Emergency Management Study Group, we've looked at ways to handle emergency management. Do we want a police department? Do we need a new police chief, or can we get away with more officers? What do we do about a new fire truck? So these are all things that I think that volunteers have come together to do, but it's getting harder and harder to get volunteers. And there are things that a town leader or town administrator could be doing. And I know these guys are putting in a lot of hours, which is from the budget committee, and all of us have been putting in a fair amount of hours too. So it's tough, but I'll give you one example that to me is a prime one that Chris left out. Medical insurance. You guys were looking for different medical insurance for the town employees this year. That's an area right there. If you don't choose the right medical plan, it could cost the town a lot of money. Do you let people who have who are eligible for insurance but don't want to take it do what we call opt out? In other words, we give them a stipend rather than their whole benefit and say, okay, if you have other insurance, fine, you're saving the town money. Well, none of us are experts talking about that. And if we made the wrong decision, it could really bite us. And so by having an administrator like that, the feeling really is that there's a lot they could do.
Mr. Jasmine, nice to see you.
Nice to be here. So I work with town administrators and town managers routinely, town administrators more. And one of the pitfalls in having a town administrator that it sounds like we may be headed for headlong is they try to get a town manager on the cheap. So they rename them town administrator, they give them all the responsibilities of town administrator, but not necessarily the power, certainly the RSA power and the rest of that. And if you're asking for someone to do all the work that I've heard just schematically, I haven't looked at the job description, I'm assuming that it's available for review, you're asking for somebody with some pretty serious credentials who will want to be paid, compensated accordingly. I don't necessarily disagree with the idea of a town administrator. At one point, Chris, you had said, before you were selected, should we hire somebody to keep track of all these things? When we were talking about the law changes and things like that. It's not a bad idea. They can be very helpful. There is a lot of the spreadsheets that can be made and the insurance stuff and keeping up with the RSAs and all the rest of that. But schematically, what I'm hearing is we want a town manager. We're not going to call him or her town manager, and it doesn't sound like we're going to pay him or her town manager. And I'd be careful about how much you're asking this individual to do versus how much you're expecting to pay and what kind of credentials you're really looking for.
I have a question. Will this person have the power to hire and fire as he sees fit, in all these different avenues here?
Power to recommend.
Well, what does that mean?
That means if,
Power
Recommend
to hire,
who?
fire,
The three of you
and
guys?
with the selectmen.
To the select.
yeah.
And you have the power, obviously, to do that. Okay, so
For most
those
people.
recommendations,
Not for all.
okay.
So I'll be the first to admit that my sample size is very small, but I met with the town manager in Lineborough, which is a town exactly the size of this one, both in terms of population and finance. And I was very impressed by their guy. So was Rich Nalamenko, who's not here to tell me what a great idea I had. But, it's a bachelor's degree in public administration. It's not a job description that we made up. We said, how's it work here? And then we interviewed the select board with and without that guy in the room, and that's how we became enthusiastic about this concept. But I'll remind you that the ultimate, the two things. One, we're not committed to doing this tomorrow morning. The voters have the ultimate say. If you elect to defund that line item, there's no question about what will happen to that position going forward. And you might be able to convince us tonight through rhetoric to set that number to 0. I'm fine with that as well, Mr. Jasmine.
You started that by saying you met with the town manager or the town?
Town administrator.
Okay, the administrator.
Town manager is a different piece of legislation, and I think that the reason we want a town administrator is because they're easier to get rid of than town managers if they screw up.
Well, it also means that they actually only recommend.
That's right.
You guys still make all the decisions.
That's right. What we think we're looking for is the component of this particular man's job that makes him the frontline, day-to-day supervisor and administrator of town affairs. You're essentially running a $4.2 million corporation with 3 part-time guys at the moment.
From when I was selected, I think that the largest value of a town administrator would be we only have a few employees, I know that, but there's a lot of interface messaging from the select board to those employees that Linda gets kind of saddled with. And it's an awkward place she finds herself in. A lot of personal issues, a lot of personnel issues. It's not comfortable, and I don't know really how it's written up in her job description, to be honest with you.
By default, all that stuff falls in that office. So, you want to continue to talk about this, Priscilla?
I just wanted to know the line item for this position.
Chris will find it for you.
I don't know, Joe, which one is it? I think, is that in, 110? I believe it is within that. Yeah, 110 or 120? I assume 120. That would be within 110, that's page 1, the very first line item.
And what was the percent on that?
The administrative assistant wages, that item?
Yes. And that could certainly be renamed, which if anybody would recommend that before I do, will recommend that be renamed.
So the structure you envision is replacing what is now Linda's job with the town administrator, and then Kelly is the clerical?
What we think what we know the staff is going to look like April 1st is that Linda's going to quit. She's going to 16 hours a week for as long as we can keep her on to serve as the institutional memory and to complete Kelly's training into a town clerical ninja. What we think will happen is that we will hire an additional clerical position